Welcome to the Team Teach podcast. I'm Clare, and in each episode you'll find me talking with an expert guest to learn more about behaviour. We squeeze a lot into each episode. You'll listen to the latest thinking in behaviour, continue your professional development with our book recommendation, and then I'll send you away with 3 practical tips you can use in your setting. I'm joined today by Dr Judith Howard. Judith is an associate professor from the education faculty at Queensland University of Technology and is a leading researcher and educator in the field of trauma-aware education in Australia. Before moving to academia, Judith had an extensive career history as a teacher, school counsellor and student behaviour specialist. At Queensland University of Technology, Judith oversees pre-service and postgraduate teacher education in trauma-aware education and has developed online courses that are reaching thousands nationally and internationally. She's led the development of the national guidelines for trauma-aware education and is the author of 2 books, Distressed or Deliberately Defiant, Managing Challenging Student Behaviour Due to Trauma and Disorganised Attachment in 2013, and Trauma-Aware Education, Essential Information and Guidance for Educators, Education Sites and Education Systems in 2022. She's also the founder and principal chair of the large biannual Trauma-Aware Education Conference held in Australia. We are so lucky to have such a powerhouse of a guest, and we today are discussing trauma-aware education. Enjoy the episode. Hi Judith, how are you?
I'm very well. Lovely to be with you tonight, or this morning, depending on where you are in the world.
I know, yeah, we're so global now. I'm like, it's 9 o'clock here, 6 p.m. with you. And hopefully with the time difference and being very far away from each other, our sound is really nice and clear. So I'm really hoping with that. I'm really excited about the topic today. It's something that I'm personally very interested in. We're talking about trauma-aware education. I wondered if you could start, Judith, just with a quick intro to the listener about yourself.
Sure. So I commenced my career as a classroom teacher, and then I moved into school counsellor work and did a lot of specialist behaviour work with highly at-risk young people for the education department in Queensland, Australia, and did that for a long time. And I always say those kids were my greatest teachers because they taught me all about the work that I've done since then. So pretty much my whole career, I've done lots and lots of different things, but I've always had a focus on the children and young people who I suppose present with the most challenging behaviour. And very clearly the main pattern that came out was that most of these young people have lived through this thing called complex trauma. So I've really shaped my career out to really investigate this and to do something about this. So I now work at a big university that has about 55,000 students, and we are leading nationally and internationally significant work in this area called trauma-aware education, which keeps me very, very busy.
Yeah, I've done lots of research and kind of reading around the work that you do, and it's absolutely amazing. And I know previously when I've worked and researched and written things, that Australia is often leading the way, I feel, from what I've read in research in the area, and there's some amazing resources and documents that I've particularly used. So it's really great to have your knowledge and expertise on the topic on the podcast today. We usually start off with our reflective question, which I love doing. What you wish you knew then that you know now about the topic?
Yes, well, I probably in saying this is something that people often say to me as well. I wish I knew now. I wish I knew what I know now when I worked with that kid. When I worked with that young person and I responded to their behaviours in a way based on what I knew then that actually caused more harm. I wish I knew now. I wish I knew then what I know now about the impact of trauma on their not only their education experience, but their life experience. And I would have done things a whole lot differently. So I suppose that, and a lot of people say that to me, including people who are principals of schools, people who lead education departments, people who've been in the business a long time. They often say that to me. So.
It really flicks a light bulb on with people, I think. But it is hard looking back and being like, oh gosh, like why didn't we know that? And I might have said this on the podcast before, but I remember working in pupil referral units for the first time in the UK, which are places where children go if they get excluded from a mainstream provision, small schools. And we just had no training on trauma. This is a long time ago. We had nothing, and you just did it by gut, and your gut is good, but actually not based on like a whole body of evidence. And I find it frustrating, similar to you, Judith, looking back and just being like, oh, why didn't we know? So
Yeah.
it's
I think there
tricky,
were
but
good reasons why we didn't know. I think there were good, or not so good reasons why we didn't know. You know, there just wasn't. It wasn't embedded in our training when we went through university to become teachers. This didn't exist. There was a whole lot of other stuff that, if you were lucky, you got taught about, which was to do with behaviour management, but it just didn't touch on this stuff. And we're really, a lot of our work now is trying to change that.
Yeah, it's going in at the source, isn't it, to give people the right information and the right skills from early on. If you work with parents and carers, our family engagement training equips you with the skills, knowledge and understanding to build positive relationships. Help your families understand and support their child's behaviour, recognise the challenges and opportunities in your organisation, and receive an exclusive range of resources you can use to practically support your families. Take a look at this exciting training option on the Team Teach website. I think many of the listeners will have a really good understanding of roughly what trauma-aware education is, or trauma-informed education. It's kind of labelled under different things. But I wondered if you could just give us a quick definition.
So I try and simplify it for educators. It's basically an understanding that's informed by evidence from neuroscience mostly, that basically is saying there's an impact on the developing nervous systems of young kids when trauma is in the mix, when they are experiencing maltreatment or really significant violence or abuse, all these sorts of things. It's not just a physical, externally physically harmful thing. It actually has an impact on the developing nervous system, the brain and the whole nervous system. And if something's not done about that during these very vulnerable periods of development, like early childhood and adolescence, and while we've got these lovely young mushy brains to work with, if something's not done about that, then the impact can continue even into adulthood and even impact the parenting behaviours of these young people. So the impact on the nervous system leads to behaviour. So what we see in classrooms is behaviour. What we interpret from that behaviour, depending on how we're trained, is either this is a choice, this is a deliberately chosen response to something, and they should be choosing better, and therefore we respond to that with consequences, discipline, all these things that we've been trained to do. Or we see it as a response from a dysregulated nervous system that shuts down the part of the brain that does the choosing stuff, and we see it in a whole different light. And so we go, well, how can we work with that young person during the days, weeks, years we have them with us in a way that's trauma-informed and can develop their capacities to be able to respond differently in education environments and therefore in life. So that's a really simplistic description, but I try and simplify all that. I don't expect, and no one expects, teachers to be neuroscientists or therapists, but what they can do is work on the 3 areas that these kids have most trouble with, and those areas are their perceptions of safety. They're not good at feeling safe coming through the school gate or coming into your classroom or being with you. They can feel very unsafe. So we need to work on that. The second thing is their capacity for relating to others can be quite impaired, and so they have trouble with compassion and all these things that we think are admirable human behaviours. They can present as quite cold or nasty or whatever else, because they don't do relationships well. And the third thing is emotional regulation. So they're not good at self-soothing, calming themselves down. And if you're not good at those three things, feeling safe, relationships and emotional regulation, you're probably going to play up at school, and you're probably going to face some significant consequences or punishments. And that's why these kids are so often excluded, expelled, suspended. And to flip that, a trauma-aware education response works on those three areas. So how can we help these kids feel more safe? How can we help them with relationships? How can we help them with their emotional regulation, and embedding that stuff in every day, every year that we have them with us?
Yeah, and I really like the way you just nail it down really and split it into those three key areas. I think it helps educators to understand better those areas that really need that extra input. And when I was reading about you and looking at what you've written, I really liked the title of your first book, Distressed or Deliberately Defiant. And I really liked it because actually when I go in and do training, I do lots of training in different areas, but some touches on this topic. There is a body of staff that will be still in that deliberately defiant kind of category. And this type of training and development for staff can help to switch it, I guess, to actually that's someone, crying out for help or being distressed. But I just wondered about that a little bit in your experience about how we can help support those staff that are really stuck in that deliberately defiant camp.
Yeah, I think the science is the answer. And this is coming from many years of my doing this work. You can, because of how we're trained and what we believe as educators, what we believe as truth, or what we believe is the right way to deal with behaviour, it's very hard to shift us from that. But what happens when you hear the actual science, what's going on inside bodies and brains, what emotional dysregulation is, and how it shuts down prefrontal cortical activity, how it, all the different parts of the brain and what's going on inside bodies and brains. When you hear the science, that changes not only hearts but minds and people's beliefs. And so they start, I keep saying, this whole thing is about thinking differently, believing differently, planning differently, how we plan for student behaviour support, and acting differently from an informed perspective, rather than one that's totally grounded in behaviourist methodologies, which everybody learns about at university, reinforcing behaviours, extinguishing behaviours, doing all that stuff around chosen behaviour, learnt behaviour, doesn't tend to work well with these kids. So you have to do things from a slightly different way of thinking, believing, planning and acting, which is quite actually liberating for educators, particularly because working with these kids with high-level behaviours is not a lot of fun, and it can really take a piece out of your soul. And when educators learn about this, they go, really? I had no idea. This makes everything seem different now. And they tend to go back to work with a smile on their face because there's hope. There's something they can do about it. They see the kids differently. They see their jobs differently. So the work that we lead in Australia is just as much about the educators as it is about the kids. And the well-being, the personal and professional well-being of educators is paramount in what we're doing. Yeah.
It really is. And it's interesting to hear you say about that shift, because I know that it's really helped me, that what I know working with some really risky young people. I work one day a week in an autistic provision, kind of doing therapeutic interventions. And one of the individuals that I've worked with over the years, they do show very risky behaviors, but the main focus of what we're doing for that person's provision, based on a complex trauma kind of background, is just getting him to feel safe.
Yeah,
Like that's
yeah,
it. And actually, when you nail down the target, if you want to talk in real education terms of like, let's just get them feeling safe,
yeah,
secure,
yeah,
loved, connected,
yeah,
to staff, and then wheeling that out to other students, that for me has been so helpful, because you kind of have this understanding of what you're doing, but it's not, you're not trying to get them to do work or do very demand based things. It's actually, quite simplified, and that's
yeah.
helped me with really high needs
Yeah, there's a
individuals.
little sayings like care before curriculum and all this sort of stuff. But unfortunately, there's this misbelief out there that this is being soft, or
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
just being nice to those poor kids when you really should be a bit tougher. That's what they need. And this sort of an understanding that's been pervasive for donkey's years. It really has.
Hmm.
I've been highly trained in behaviour work. I used to run functional behaviour assessments for the high level kids. I used to do this, I used to do that, all the rest of it just didn't work with the trauma impacted kids. And so I had to take a step back. And when people came to me and they said, oh, you're just being soft, or you're just, that's that marshmallow stuff, that trauma stuff or whatever, I will stand firm. I am not an underinformed or ill-informed or soft
No.
practitioner or theorist or anything else. I'm coming from evidence, and I'm coming from a way that is more likely to be successful than what we've done for years that hasn't worked,
Hmm.
and has ended up with all these young people in detention centres or out on the street, or certainly not finishing their schooling. So so it's, I don't ever tell me I'm soft.
Yeah, no, say I'm like, no. I'm as
No,
tough as they come, because I stick
yeah,
with them. I stay with them. I
yeah,
think that takes such bravery and honesty and care for
mm,
yourself to be able to like
yeah.
keep going with those kids, because it's not easy for staff. But I really wanted to ask you something about the evidence base, because I'm quite nerdy, and I'm really into the kind of, when I do training, and I really want to know, like, what is the evidence base that this kind of approach is helpful. I know that can be hard to gather, but I know it's growing.
It is growing. It's still, if you think of evidence as gold standard, the sorts of random control trials looking at doing this and having other groups that don't get this and all that sort of stuff. We're very early on in that sort of evidence, and schools love that sort of evidence. They go, okay, I want gold standard research evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I'm not going to invest in this, or I'm not going to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've actually written a whole paper on this, because
Yeah.
this is, you have to think differently from a research perspective. There's actually decades of scientific evidence that we draw on for this. And it's good evidence. It's deep science. It's crazy science. I actually teach a whole subject on this at my university, the
Mm-hmm.
science of complex trauma. It's incredibly interesting, and it's very, very deep quality science from all over the world. That's our evidence base, and we draw from that to translate that into education practice. But in terms of random control trials of doing this at one school or not doing it at another school and comparing the schools and all these things that education systems love and
Mm-hmm.
believe in, that's still very young, but it's as you said, it's growing. It's definitely growing. Where the amount of publications that are coming out every day across my desk in this space is really encouraging, and it's not going to stop.
It is, and I always think with the evidence base with this kind of work, it's so tricky, because I work therapeutically one to one, and I can say, from we do bits of feedback and various things, and we can see improvements, but it is very hard to something tangible is, if it's like
Yeah,
reading or
sometimes,
writing, it's tangible. Yeah.
yeah, sometimes um, success is that young person is still alive.
Yeah.
And
Uh-huh.
then you'll have an education perspective that says, yes, but what's their numeracy and literacy like?
So
And you
cute.
go, okay, hang on a minute, let's take this back a step. So education's a funny field. You're always combating these belief sets and priority and all these things that are out there and have been quite solid for a long time, and sometimes this is it's called what I call it is a problematizing. This is how I work with my students. We've got to look at these structures, these policies, these systemic things that we've believed in for so long, and then put our critical thinking caps on and go, yeah, but what about these kids? Now that we know what's going on in their bodies and brains, now we know what is recommended, what is should be avoided. How do we problematize these things? And so I get a lot of my students at my university to actually take a piece of the curriculum or to take an education practice or whatever, and to problematize it and go, well, what about these kids and what can we do differently to more effectively meet their needs? So yeah, I think it's a really intriguing area, and the education system is not fun to work with sometimes, very complex, always moving pieces, always people changing jobs and leaders changing, and so you're always running to catch up. But we're certainly doing a lot of national work where I'm working, and trying to change things systemically. So most of my work now is I don't work with kids. I work with the systems that are influencing what's happening with the young people in our schools. So
yeah, and I find that myself, not in the provision that I'm in now, but I've worked in mainstream schools, high schools, running kind of therapeutic interventions with the idea of reducing exclusions. And I love it, and I'm so passionate about it, but I realize on the front line, without systemic change, you're kind of a very small wheel in a massive cog where there's so many outside influences, and you can make a difference. And we all do as educators, like every day we're building connections and we're helping the lives of those kids. But yeah, the bigger picture is that systemic change. And I think leading on from that, Judith, what I was really interested in, what I read in your book, was around the future outcomes for children affected by complex trauma. I was quite interested in some of the bits and some of the bits that I've researched around the prison pipeline kind of research. I wondered if you could say a bit more around that.
Yeah, well, the prevalence data speaks volumes, and I know this is not just Australia. I'm sure you can speak to this in the UK, across the United States, in many parts of the world. The numbers are not small that we're talking about. There's really worrying data. We've just had a really big study happen in Australia that's suggesting around 30 or even more than 30% of people in Australia have experienced child maltreatment before the age of 18. That's not a small number. And if you take it back to how many are sitting in classrooms across our country, this is a significant group of people that we're talking about. If that doesn't get addressed, and going to see a therapist once a fortnight, although it's great, it's not going to have as much impact on that lovely plastic brain and that lovely nervous system that has such potential as it would have if that sort of the approach we're recommending happens every day there at school with the people they're with. Now, that's why we push it so hard, because schools have such potential. Early childhood provisions have such potential to do great things in terms of what's happening in bodies and brains. If that doesn't happen, the science is a little bit sad and scary. What we call unresolved trauma can lead to significant concerns in adulthood that can lead to more violence. It can lead to, we get high numbers of kids put in detention centres with high numbers of people in adult prisons have a history of childhood trauma. There's also this really worrying science that suggests there's an intergenerational impact, so that the studies, the science that's informing this is even looked at the genetic level of what's going on in nervous systems, and it suggests that this type of harm, particularly during the early childhood years, can change what's going on with genes, and that can be passed on to the next generation if it's not addressed. However, the good news is what we do with these kids and the lovely experiences we can give them throughout their schooling years can actually also change what's going on with genes, and that can go on. So that leads to what we call resolved trauma. And even though the memories are still awful, and it's not, the fact that someone like myself, if it was me, the fact that I lived through trauma, it's not going to disappear, but it's not going to define me or my future parenting anymore, because it's resolved. So what we do with them while we've got them at school matters. It really matters. And if that isn't addressed, it actually is very expensive for societies.
Yeah.
And there's lots of research that looks at this. If we don't address this, it impacts on housing, it impacts on employment, it impacts on social services and prisons and all these other things, mental health, consumption, all these things are packed with costs that are associated with unresolved trauma. So it's not a little thing, and it's not being soft and nice to kids at school. It's actually, it grows legs. It's quite a big systemic problem, and it deserves a systemic solution. And that's why most of my work now is systemic work, to support all those kids, but also those wonderful educators going to work every day to support them.
No, I couldn't believe it when I read it in your book. I'd never really come across the stats around the expense. And I feel like you mentioned that in your book as well, that that kind of feels like it belittles the experience in some ways, that obviously the children and young people that we work with aren't just a number, and it isn't just about money, but it was staggering the billions that it can cost trying to support. But I think, drawing on what you've just said there, Judith, about what educators can do in their service, I just wondered if you could run through a few of the things that we know are very helpful for our children and young people.
Yeah, so I suppose that's one of the things I get asked the most. It's
top tips.
Tell me about the strategies, and that's why I say, give me your book, but I want chapter 5. It's on strategies. I just want to read. And so I always say, take a breath, take a step back, read the other stuff first, because the science informs the strategies, justifies the strategies. And when you think it's not working the first time you've used a strategy, you won't throw it out, because you know that you're working on a changing nervous system, a changing brain, and it'll take time. So the types of things we ask people to consider are around those 3 areas of safety, relationships, emotional regulation. So, for example, how could you help a young person feel safer coming to school? Can you put a particular mentor role they're available in the morning when they get to school, so they know that even if they're dysregulated because there's been yelling and screaming at home or whatever else, they know all they have to do is walk down that pathway, round the garden bed, through that door, and there's their safe relationship. And that person knows that their job is all about regulating or helping to regulate that young person before class number 1. So to just have a strategy like that in place can change things for class number 1. And we know that if a young person turns up in a bad way for class number 1, that can extend throughout the whole day. So it's trying to put in place things to help kids feel safe, feel related and protected, and to be emotionally regulated throughout the school day, and to make that repeated, predictable and trusted. And it takes a little bit of time, because these kids have been through enough harm not to really believe that grown-ups in the world are there to do the right thing by them. So it takes quite a bit of time. And they can also do this thing called sabotaging the relationship. So it's in all the literature, but it's when, and this breaks the hearts of educators. They put so much effort into a young person, and they think they've just won them over, and then the young person will just throw it back in their face, and it really hurts, and it makes you want to give up. But when you understand that this is a common symptom of living with complex trauma in your life, you can expect it. You can go, okay, I know where this is coming from, and you can reframe that to, okay, let's get back in and do the work you need to get through that sort of thing. So, yeah, there's lots of things. I could talk all night about strategies, but yeah, I really recommend people read about the science first, and the bigger picture stuff, but then there's some evidence out there on different things you can put in place that are working on those three big areas.
Yeah, and you're right. I know when I do training, whether it's team teach, trauma-informed training, that everyone wants to know the strategies, but it always comes back for me is that just every individual is different. So, individuals that have had complex trauma might share that kind of title of having faced that and kind of surviving that, but hopefully we just do that individualized approach and understand that everyone's needs will be slightly different within that. So it's always that there's lots, isn't there, based on the evidence, but actually what works for one may not work for another.
That's exactly right. You've hit it on the head. That's so true. And that's a very big part of this is get to know your young person, the little person or the not so little person with whom you're working, and involve them in the decision making for the things you're going to put in place as well, in a very respectful way. And when you start to develop those trusting relationships, kids do want to be involved in that and part of the solution, which is very good for them and very helpful for us. So yeah.
It really is that autonomy, that choice. It makes such a difference. I can't believe time, Judith. I literally am like, I just want to plug your brains a bit more and get more out of you. But I just wondered if we could finish with our 3 top tips.
Yeah, I suppose my first one is learn more. If you don't know anything or don't know much about this stuff, tonight or today is not going to be enough for you. I advise you read, you get hold of information. We run a really big conference every 2 years for that reason over in Australia, and it's happening at the end of this year, and it's getting information right out across the country and beyond. So find the sources where you'll get more information. That would be my first tip. My second would be open your thinking. Start to problematize, start to critically think about the age-old processes you've used to do behaviour management, to do student support, and ask the question, what about these kids? Is this going to be effective based on what we now know about the impact of trauma? And I suppose the third thing is advocate. Once you've got enough under your belt, you've learnt enough and you think this is actually really important, you do need to advocate. It's not easy when you're the only one at a school waving the flag, but sharing readings, sharing videos, advocate in staff meetings, get the word out there so that ideally you get to a whole organisation approach, a whole school approach, which is obviously better than one person waving the flag. And then hopefully, and this is what's happening certainly in Australia, then those schools, those organisations, those people are advocating for system level support and change. And that's when it gets really exciting. So yeah, just a few little things I'm asking for there. But
just the whole systemic change across the system. Yes, I think we can do it. Yeah. We will change the world. We can do it. But thank you so much, Judith, for your time. That's been a brilliant episode, and I will catch up with you soon.
Okay, lovely. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Team Teach podcast. It's been great to have you here with us as we discuss behaviour, communication, and the ways we can best support those in our care. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.